Devil May Cry, Ninja Gaiden, and God of War. These are the three main games that I picture in my head when I think about old school action games, the ones that really helped establish the genre that we see today. Growing up, I didn't get the chance to play all three series at that time, only got the chance to play Devil May Cry, but I am currently an adult. So I made the big boy decision to buy these games and play them in my spare time. Now, I've grown to fully appreciate what each series has to offer, and oh man, I can't wait to talk about God of War when I get the chance, since I've only played a little bit of God of War 1 and I've beaten God of War 3. And earlier this year, I went out my way to buy the entire series, so I'm itching to go through all of them. So expect that to happen sometime next year. Since these games have come out, there have been many other action games that did their own thing. Some of them were pretty great and will be fondly remembered for a very long time, offering replayability for nearly a lifetime. Others might be talked about once in a blue moon. And then there's some games that you dread on talking about because its utter existence brings you pain. But that's for a different time, not today. While people were playing and discussing these three big titans in the action game genre, a new game called Darksiders was announced. Darksiders was kind of doing its own thing. You know, it was just chilling off in its own corner right next to Dante's Inferno and Castlevania Lords of Shadow. I actually remember hearing about this game at the tail end of high school, and I even watched my friends play it thinking that it wasn't very special. Probably because my friend that was playing at that time was just mindlessly button mashing, and eventually I did manage to play the game on Steam, but when I tried it out, I didn't really beat it, and I'm not really sure why I stopped playing either. I think I got my attention caught by something else during that time, but I don't know. However, playing it again earlier this month was a rewarding experience. I've always been a fan of Legend of Zelda as well as action games as a whole, and the mechanics also has some depth to them in this game. And while War himself has a solid moveset to mess around with, the bosses and enemies are a different story, which I will get into later in this video. But honestly, Darksiders has a pretty good foundation of a combat system that actually just works, despite the flaws that I saw, which is why I really wanted to do a deep dive of the game, hence the name of the video. When I first got into Darksiders 1, I noticed just how weighted War feels. He's a chunky fella. A lot of his attacks aren't really that fast and they take some time to come out. There's this slow, deliberate wind up for a lot of these moves, but they don't feel slow enough to make the game feel bad. The main weapon that he uses, Chaos Eater, has a lot of normal attacks that you see out of a standard action game. Ground combo strings, a launcher, aerial combo strings, a gap closing move, and some special attacks that he can do too. He even has two different launchers, one that allows him to stand his ground while lifting his opponents in the air, and another launcher that causes War to rise in the air too. Although if you hold down the melee button with the first launcher, you can ascend in the air as well. So I'm a little confused why there's two launchers that do pretty much the same thing, especially since it's on the same weapon. Outside of his main weapon, he also has sub-weapons too. His sub-weapons behave somewhat similarly where they have similar moves, but they have their own differences. The scythe covers large sweeping areas around him depending on which attack that he uses, and the gauntlets, while they have shorter range, allow you to charge your attacks at will. The gauntlets even have their own just charge mechanic too, similar how Devil May Cry 4 handles Gilgamesh, where if you time the release of a melee attack, you do extra damage. When you do this correctly, the screen pauses for a bit and you get some additional effects around War. You can swap through these sub-weapons with the D-pad, so you can use all three of your melee weapons all at once. These three weapons add a good amount of fun in War's playstyle, but there are additional tools that War will collect during his adventure. As you progress through the game, War also gains new gear and new wrath abilities that he's able to use. The gear that you gain are useful for specific puzzles or accessing key areas, like using Crossblade to hit a switch from afar so you can solve a puzzle, or using Earthcaller to activate a Stone Warden. There's also Ruin, which is a horse that can be used for certain traversal areas. Mercy, which the main use of this gun is to get rid of these ash worms, and unfortunately it's not really used for anything else. Voidwalker, a portal device similar to a certain game that you may be familiar with. The Abyssal Chain, which lets you attach yourself to anchor points so you can hoist yourself to the target or simply swing to jump to a different area. And then there's the Mask of Shadows, which lets you see objects that you couldn't before. As for the Wrath abilities, there are only 4 of these and each ability consumes Wrath. When you first get Wrath, you only get 2 bars of Wrath, so good luck on taking advantage to whatever ability that you use. You can gain more wrath as you progress through the game by collecting these wrath shards. When you collect 4 of them, then it gives you another bar. Depending on how much meteor that you have, you probably won't be using these skills that often, or at least as often as your normal attacks, but they still have their own uses. Blade Geyser is basically a get the fuck off me move that stun enemies, and it has some invincibility. Stone Skin gives War more defense and his damage increases. Immolate sets War on fire and causes any enemy that comes in contact with War to be set on fire as well, while also taking damage. Both Stone Skin and Immolate get this neat hitbox that pushes enemies at an upward angle. And since both of these abilities slowly drain your wrath, you can use them repeatedly by immediately switching off the skill. The last ability, Affliction, summons ghost snakes that fly towards his foes. This does a lot of damage on a minion, and it causes enemies to go high in the air too. Once one enemy dies, they immediately beeline towards the next unfortunate victim until they phase out. And War also has access to this chaos form, which allows him to do massive damage around him towards the enemies that he fights and whatnot. It is flat out boring. It's the most boring ass form that I ever use in any action game. The only reason why you would ever use this form is so you can avoid damage while attacking a specific enemy like a boss or something. It's repetitive, you don't have a lot of attack strings in general, you can't jump, you can't block, you can't dodge, you can't even wave to your grandmother crossing the street. You can't do anything with this. Hey, future ChaserTech here. I completely missed that he can actually jump in this form, and he has 2 sets of moves that he can do, but he still can't do that much in general. So I just want to add this here. Now back to the video. Even with all of these abilities and tools available, the game can still feel really limited at a first glance. But taking a closer look at some of War's gear, you will realize that some of them can be used to attack enemies, notably Crossblade, Earthcaller, Mercy, and the Abyssal Chain. With Crossblade, it acts as a regular projectile that can bounce between enemies, so it can be very useful to stun enemies away from you. When you hold down the button that's used for the gear options, you can actually charge this move even further, and it will stay on a singular target. Earthcaller, the horn, was something that I originally thought that can only be used to activate the Stone Wardens, but apparently on my recent playthrough of this game, I found out that you can actually use this against enemies. It knocks enemies away from you in the air and on the ground, while also having a decent amount of range to it too. Mercy, the gun, is similar to Crossblade where you can use it to attack enemies from afar, except at a greater distance. It doesn't do a lot of damage even when upgraded with impact rounds, but I guess it's useful for juggling enemies and catching creatures as they're being knocked away. But there are some very specific uses for it, which I won't get into now, but you will see why. There's the Abyssal Chain, which there's not really too much that you can say about it. I mean, it can be used to reel enemies towards you or pull yourself towards a larger target. Depending on the distance, the enemy can get launched from this gear, but it's a pretty useful thing to use if you want to kind of manipulate enemies from a certain distance or just control your overall spacing. Oh yeah, I almost forgot. There's also Ruin, which is his horse. It can be used to attack enemies, but that's only within certain traversal scenarios. The dash attack that can be done with the horse can be used to crash into enemies, while attacking with the melee button causes enemies to be launched away. This is more used for just getting enemies off of you, I guess, if you're on the run. It's not really used for combat specifically, especially since there's a lot of areas that you cannot use it, but I guess it's useful for very specific areas. Now, since we've taken a step back to see what exactly that War's gear can be capable of, now you can see that these items greatly increases War's capability in combat, making him a lot more fun to play. And even despite what I said earlier about War kind of feeling very slow and maybe a little sluggish, with all of these items combined together, he can be extremely fast, and I will explain right now. War's regular attack strings can be canceled into other actions like jumping, for instance. So in the middle of hitting an enemy, you can jump to extend your strings if needed. This also includes using his gear or other weapons as well. In a lot of various action games, the animations of your attacks cannot be interrupted mid-animation with another attack unless there's a specific mechanic that allows for this, such as enemy step in Devil May Cry. You can cancel most attacks of its ending animation frames, but usually not right in the middle of it. Darksiders 1 kind of lets you do this, but not with a lot of attacks. You can use different attacks to cancel into other moves on the ground and in the air very, very fast. This makes War really adaptable and flexible, allowing him to be relentless as possible against hordes of enemies. At least most of the time. On the ground, he can dish out a lot of damage by chaining different types of attacks together with all of his tools. Now, if he's in the air, it becomes a completely different story. In normal scenarios, War cannot do a whole lot if you just use his main weapon, which is Chaos Eater. He has a few options in the air, but not really enough to keep him going and preventing him from slamming back on the ground. But if you add in all of his sub-weapons and his gear, he can basically stay in the air indefinitely. In fact, when you use a specific combination of weapons, mostly with crossblade and the scythe, you can actually gain height the more you keep up this specific combo chain. This can prevent any enemy from attacking you from below, but honestly, it's not really needed due to how big War hitboxes are for a lot of moves that he has. So it's more of a bonus if you want to juggle enemies while you're also in the air. On the ground, he's more than capable of just slapping around his foes without any issues. I kind of like that War doesn't really have a whole lot of combo strings. Not that they're bad, but I always prefer to having a select number of moves with a few combo strings here and there. That way I can just stack different types of attacks together rather than memorizing a pre-made combo. Canceling into a variety of attacks just feels satisfying. I don't know, just something about it. With the fairly decent sized pool of attacks that War has, you might have realized one small thing I forgot to mention. It's about his defensive options. I wanted to save them for last because they're kind of interesting. He has two different defensive options when he's fighting regular enemies or bosses in general. One of the options that you can do is block. He can do this on the ground and in the air, and if you time a block successfully, you will be able to counterattack enemies. Sometimes this can cause them to be stunned in the process. Now, there are some attacks that enemies will perform that are unblockable, which is kind of annoying to figure out. At least I'm pretty sure that they are unblockable because every time that I will try to block specific attacks, I end up getting popped in the mouth every time I did. Now, with this block, you have the capacity to use it to cancel some attacks that you do. Most of his regular attacks with Chaos Eater can be immediately canceled the moment you input the move. This allows War to constantly attack a target with a barrage of hits. It's a little silly too. War looks like he's tweaking out, just jittering a million miles a second. Another defensive mechanic that he has access to is dodging. And let me tell you something about this dodge because it's polarizing, but it makes War a little nuts. When you use this dodge, War will do this sliding dash that sends him into a very linear direction. This dodge can be used in the air, and like its grounded counterpart, it has similar horizontal range when you go left, right, or backwards. But when you dodge forwards, it goes into this downward trajectory for some weird reason. I'm not sure why. The end lag for both of these dodges are a bit long, so you might think, this dodge feels kind of like crap. And I agree with you, my friend. It feels really, really stiff. Also want to point out that it's not an actual dodge either. Like, it has no iframes. Its only job is to move War's big ass out the way of the hitbox that's coming straight towards him. That's it. So if you see a big ugly demon trying to get you, make sure that you are well out the way because you're going to get smacked mid-dodge no matter what you do. However, there are different ways to manipulate this dodge. One way is canceling an air dodge while shooting Mercy. War will use the momentum that he gains from dodging, and it allows him to drift rather than just drop in place. You can't really act out of Mercy for some odd reason, since there seems to be some sort of cooldown. Maybe it's due to the dodge cooldown, but I'm not entirely sure. However, there are different ways to speed up the dodge itself so you can use it continuously. Method 1 is if you keep the control stick neutral after you initially dodge. So basically what happens is that if you hold a direction while you're dodging, you'll get the normal amount of end lag associated with the dodge. But if you change the direction of the control stick, or if you keep the stick to neutral after dodging, you can link different dodges into each other. This makes War faster than he was before, but there's another way that makes him even more absurd. So basically, the second way to make this dodge crazy is that you have to do one simple trick. When you dodge, there is one attack that allows him to cancel this dodge, which is War's attack with Chaos Eater when you hold down the melee button to do a launcher. During the very few frames of the startup of this move, you can dodge again. So when you chain all this together, you can do this. Yeah, I learned about this when I watched the speedrun of Darksiders 1 a while ago, and the first thing that I saw was this technique after looking up the speedrun. And I'm surprised that it still works, especially in the War Master edition, because there was some glitches that got patched out that I kind of like out of Darksiders 2, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. This technique increases War's movement like crazy, allowing him to dash across the map like a madman. You can't use this to dash forward really fast, but you can use this technique to dash left, right, and backwards really quickly. The only downside is that you cannot buy Power Strike. The moment you do, kiss this exploit goodbye, because the move will override the input required to do this technique. Even if you stagger blocking and pressing the melee button, there are a certain amount of frames where you cannot press both buttons without causing this move to happen. So not enabling this skill at all allows for a lot of flexibility while you're on the ground with your dodges. Keep that in mind. Now, as much as I like what is possible with War and how flexible his combat feels, there's a lot that can be said about the enemies and both the bosses in this game, and none of it is good, outside a few minor things. To me, enemy AI is very important to consider in action games, because if something isn't challenging enough, the game can feel like an easy summer breeze and you can waltz your way through the campaign without taking a hint of a struggle. After playing Ninja Gaiden, my mindset has changed about action games as a whole. Not saying that Darksiders 1 was really easy or anything, but it really puts in perspective what a good challenge can offer. Action games should have at least some form of obstacle for the player to overcome, but depending on the developer's intentions, I guess it depends on how they want their game to be perceived. While I thought most of the enemies were really easy to blitz through, there were some that kind of stood out. Regular grunt enemies were just easy to deal with since they often strike you with a few different attacks. They weren't particularly aggressive at all. Even on playing the hardest mode, I didn't have too much of a problem against normal enemies that I fight. They just circle around you and just wait for their chance to take their turn to hit you, and that's about it. The smaller enemies can be launched, and unfortunately they are very, very helpless the moment that they're in the air. They can do absolutely nothing to really interact with you at all. The higher tiered enemies that you end up fighting against put up more of a fight, but sadly they're just as repetitive as a regular guy that you deal with. You can hit them a few times and they'll get stunned, and then they'll do their big lunging attack that gives you more than enough time to dodge out the way so you can slap their face a bit until this big old quick time event appears on their head so you can finish them off. There are some enemies that can be a little annoying, like the wraith creatures that you fight against. I learned the hard way while trying to block one of their attacks, and there's this one particular attack that can eat up all of your health. It's not unblockable, thankfully, but the moment that you mess up the timing while blocking them, they will drain the crap out of your health. They're probably the hardest enemy in the game by far, and even then, nothing really stops you from just sending them up to the sky and just beating them to death. I will admit, at least there are enemies that try to attack you while you're airborne. They'll end up circling around you to try to swat at you, eventually just nicking War's toes and make him just fall to the ground. That is, unless you gain enough height to evade them, which can take some time. It's not like DMC5 where the floor is lava and you're just up in the clouds, ignoring every possible threat while the demons are looking at you like, how in the world am I supposed to get up there? In Darksiders 1, they can hit you until you reach outside of their attack range, unless it is a flying angel or some other enemy that can shoot a projectile at you. Also, I noticed something as I kept playing Darksiders 1. In the beginning of the game, enemies were very common to fight against, but as the campaign continued and I reached towards the later levels, it became more about platforming and solving problems. Not that I really mind this, because I enjoy a good Zelda game. Like, I'm a pretty big Zelda fan. I felt like the puzzles that some point were a little bit out of place because there just wasn't enough enemies. Plus, I find it amusing that Darksiders 1 started off really strong with all the carnage going on in the beginning of the game, where there was so much destruction in the city, and then the game starts to slow down into a Zelda clone. Bosses, unfortunately, weren't that much better either. They range between either repetitive to mediocre and boring and bland. There were only 2 bosses that I liked that were kind of cool in concept, but after a while their shtick got kind of old relatively fast. Tiamat was okay, probably the hardest challenge of the game by far, but that's only because of the very weird tails she has when you're trying to dodge her attacks. And she killed me plenty of times because, well, me being me, I wanted to, look cool. So I just, started perfect blocking her attacks so I can keep up my offense and not slow down. But because of how unclear her animations were for attacking, I kept dying after 2 hits. But she was still the most fun out of the chosen 4 that you fight. The rest of them are pretty horrible, especially fighting the Stygian. The entire fight is just fighting this big ass worm which slithers around the sand constantly, and it's just boring and tedious. The majority of these bosses were just, they were putting me to sleep. But at least the cutscenes were nice to look at. Observing what Darksiders 1 has to offer as a whole, I'd say that the combat still holds up, and it's probably, as of right now, my favorite out of what I've played between Darksiders 1 and Darksiders 2. I'll have to do another playthrough of Darksiders 2 when I'm done with my next video, which will be about Devil May Cry 3 Virgil. That's going to be a lot of fun. But anyway, I think it's time for me to stop rambling and finish this video. So if you like my content, feel free to subscribe and all that nonsense, and I will see you guys in the next video.